Chapter 9 of The Warlord of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. With the Yellow Men. Thuvan Din was not long in joining me, and though he found the hooked weapon a strange and savage thing with which to deal, the three of us soon dispatched the 5 black-bearded warriors who opposed us. When the battle was over, our new acquaintance turned to me, and removing the shield from his wrist, held it out. I did not know the significance of his act, but judged that it was but a form of expressing his gratitude to me. I afterward learned that it symbolized the offering of a man's life in return for some great favor done him, and my act of refusing, which I had immediately done, was what was expected of me. "Then accept from Talu, Prince of Marentina," said the yellow man, "this token of my gratitude," and reaching beneath one of his wide sleeves, he withdrew a bracelet and placed it upon my arm. He then went through the same ceremony with Thuvan Din. Next he asked our names, and from what land we hailed. He seemed quite familiar with the geography of the outer world, and when I said I was from Helium, he raised his brows. "Ah," he said, "you seek your ruler and his company? Know you of them?" I asked, but little more than that they were captured by my uncle, Silensis Old, Jedak of Jedaks, ruler of Okar, land of the Yellow Men of Barsoom. As to their fate, I know nothing, for I am at war with my uncle, who would crush my power in the principality of Marentina. These from whom you have just saved me are warriors he has sent out to find and slay me, for they know that often I come alone to hunt and kill the sacred apt which Silensis Old so much reveres. It is partly because I hate his religion that Silensis Old hates me, but mostly does he fear my growing power, and the great faction which has arisen throughout Okar that would be glad to see me ruler of Okar and Jedak of Jedaks in his place. He is a cruel and tyrannous master whom all hate, and were it not for the great fear they have of him, I could raise an army overnight that would wipe out the few that might remain loyal to him. My own people are faithful to me, and the little valley of Marentina has paid no tribute to the court of Silensis Old for a year. Nor can he force us, for 12 men may hold the narrow way to Marentina against 1,000,000. But now, as to thine own affairs, how may I aid you? My palace is at your disposal if you wish to honor me by coming to Marentina. When our work is done, we shall be glad to accept your invitation, I replied. But now you can assist us most by directing us to the court of Silensis Old, and suggesting some means by which we may gain admission to the city and the palace, or whatever other place we find our friends to be confined. Talu gazed ruefully at our smooth faces, and at Thuvan Din's red skin and my white one. "First you must come to Marentina," he said, "for a great change must be wrought in your appearance before you can hope to enter any city in Okar. You must have yellow faces and black beards, and your apparel and trappings must be those least likely to arouse suspicion. In my palace is one who can make you appear as truly yellow men as does Silensis Old himself." His counsel seemed wise, and as there was apparently no other way to ensure a successful entry to Kadabra, the capital city of Okar, we set out with Talu, Prince of Marentina, for his little rock-bound country. The way was over some of the worst traveling I have ever seen, and I do not wonder that in this land, where there are neither thoats nor flyers, that Marentina is in little fear of invasion. But at last we reached our destination, the first view of which I had from a slight elevation 1/2 mile from the city. Nestled in a deep valley lay a city of Martian concrete, whose every street and plaza and open space was roofed with glass. All about lay snow and ice, but there was none upon the rounded dome-like crystal covering that enveloped the whole city. Then I saw how these people combated the rigors of the Arctic, and lived in luxury and comfort in the midst of a land of perpetual ice. Their cities were veritable hothouses, and when I had come within this one, my respect and admiration for the scientific and engineering skill of this buried nation was unbounded. The moment we entered the city, Talu threw off his outer garments of fur, as did we, and I saw that his apparel differed but little from that of the red races of Barsoom. Except for his leathern harness, covered thick with jewels and metal, he was naked, nor could one have comfortably worn apparel in that warm and humid atmosphere. For 3 days we remained the guests of Prince Talu, and during that time he showered upon us every attention and courtesy within his power. He showed us all that was of interest in his great city. The Marentina atmosphere plant will maintain life indefinitely in the cities of the North Pole, after all life upon the balance of dying Mars is extinct through the failure of the air supply, should the great central plant again cease functioning, as it did upon that memorable occasion that gave me the opportunity of restoring life and happiness to the strange world that I had already learned to love so well. He showed us the heating system that stores the sun's rays in great reservoirs beneath the city, and how little is necessary to maintain the perpetual summer heat of the glorious garden spot within this Arctic paradise. Broad avenues of sod, sown with the seed of the ochre vegetation of the dead sea bottoms, carried the noiseless traffic of light and airy ground flyers that are the only form of artificial transportation used north of the gigantic ice barrier. The broad tires of these unique flyers are but rubber-like gas bags filled with the 8th Barsoomian ray, or ray of propulsion, that remarkable discovery of the Martians that has made possible the great fleets of mighty airships that render the red man of the outer world supreme. It is this ray which propels the inherent or reflected light of the planet off into space, and when confined, gives to the Martian craft their airy buoyancy. The ground flyers of Marentina contain just sufficient buoyancy in their automobile-like wheels to give the cars traction for steering purposes, and though the hind wheels are geared to the engine and aid in driving the machine, the bulk of this work is carried by a small propeller at the stern. I know of no more delightful sensation than that of riding in one of these luxuriously appointed cars, which skim, light and airy as feathers, along the soft, mossy avenues of Marentina. They move with absolute noiselessness between borders of crimson sward and beneath arching trees, gorgeous with the wondrous blooms that mark so many of the highly cultivated varieties of Barsoomian vegetation. By the end of the 3rd day, the court barber, I can think of no other earthly appellation by which to describe him, had wrought so remarkable a transformation in both Thuvandin and myself that our own wives would never have known us. Our skins were of the same lemon color as his own, and great black beards and moustaches had been deftly affixed to our smooth faces. The trappings of warriors of Okar aided in the deception, and for where beyond the hothouse cities we each had suits of the black and yellow striped orlach. Talu gave us careful directions for the journey to Kadabra, the capital city of the Okar nation, which is the racial name of the yellow man. This good friend even accompanied us part way, and then, promising to aid us in any way that he found possible, bade us adieu. On parting, he slipped upon my finger a curiously wrought ring, set with a dead black, lustreless stone, which appeared more like a bit of bituminous coal than the priceless Barsoomian gem which in reality it is. There had been but 3 others, cut from the mother stone, he said, which is in my possession. These 3 are worn by nobles high in my confidence, all of whom have been sent on secret missions to the court of Silensis Old. Should you come within 50 feet of any of these 3, you will feel a rapid pricking sensation in the finger upon which you wear this ring. He who wears one of its mates will experience the same feeling. It is caused by an electrical action that takes place the moment 2 of these gems, cut from the same mother stone, come within the radius of each other's power. By it you will know that a friend is at hand, upon whom you may depend for assistance in time of need. Should another wearer of one of these gems call upon you for aid, do not deny him, and should death threaten you, swallow the ring rather than let it fall into the hands of enemies. Guard it with your life, John Carter, for some day it may mean more than life to you. With this parting admonition, our good friend turned back towards Marentina, and we set our faces in the direction of the city of Kadabra, and the court of Silensis Old, Jedak of Jedaks. That very evening we came within sight of the walled and glass-roofed city of Kadabra. It lies in a low depression near the pole, surrounded by rocky, snow-clad hills. From the pass through which we entered the valley, we had a splendid view of this great city of the north. Its crystal domes sparkled in the brilliant sunlight gleaming above the frost-colored outer wall that circles the entire 100 miles of its circumference. At regular intervals, great gates give entrance to the city, but even at the distance from which we looked upon the massive pile, we could see that all were closed, and in accordance with Talu's suggestion, we deferred attempting to enter the city until the following morning. As he had said, we found numerous caves in the hillsides about us, and into one of these we crept for the night. Our warm orluk skins kept us perfectly comfortable, and it was only after a most refreshing sleep that we awoke shortly after daylight on the following morning. Already the city was astir, and from several of the gates we saw parties of yellow men emerging. Following closely each detail of the instructions given us by our good friend of Marentina, we remained concealed for several hours, until one party of some half-dozen warriors had passed along the trail below our hiding place, and entered the hills by way of the pass along which we had come the previous evening. After giving them time to get well out of sight of our cave, Thuvan Din and I crept out and followed them, overtaking them when they were well into the hills. When we had come almost to them, I called aloud to their leader, when the whole party halted and turned toward us. The crucial test had come. Could we but deceive these men, the rest would be comparatively easy. "Kaor," I cried as I came closer to them. "Kaor," replied the officer in charge of the party. "We be from Ilal," I continued, giving the name of the most remote city of Okar, which has little or no intercourse with Kadabra. "Only yesterday we arrived, and this morning the captain of the gate told us that you were setting out to hunt orluks, which is a sport we do not find in our own neighborhood. We have hastened after you to pray that you allow us to accompany you." The officer was entirely deceived, and graciously permitted us to go with them for the day. The chance guess that they were bound upon an orluk hunt proved correct, and Talu had said that the chances were 10 to 1 that such would be the mission of any party leaving Kadabra by the pass through which we entered the valley, since that way leads directly to the vast plains frequented by this elephantine beast of prey. Insofar as the hunt was concerned, the day was a failure, for we did not see a single orluk. But this proved more than fortunate for us, since the yellow men were so chagrined by their misfortune that they would not enter the city by the same gate by which they had left it in the morning, as it seemed that they had made great boasts to the captain of that gate about their skill at this dangerous sport. We therefore approached Kadabra at a point several miles from that at which the party had quitted it in the morning, and so were relieved of the danger of embarrassing questions and explanations on the part of the gate captain, whom we had said had directed us to this particular hunting party. We had come quite close to the city when my attention was attracted toward a tall, black shaft that reared its head several hundred feet into the air from what appeared to be a tangled mass of junk or wreckage, now partially snow-covered. I did not dare venture an inquiry for fear of arousing suspicion by evident ignorance of something which, as a yellow man, I should have known. But before we reached the city gate, I was to learn the purpose of that grim shaft and the meaning of the mighty accumulation beneath it. We had come almost to the gate when one of the party called to his fellows, at the same time pointing toward the distant southern horizon. Following the direction he indicated, my eyes descried the hull of a large flyer approaching rapidly from above the crest of the encircling hills. "Still other fools who would solve the mysteries of the forbidden north," said the officer, half to himself. "Will they never cease their fatal curiosity?" "Let us hope not," answered one of the warriors, "for then what should we do for slaves and sport?" "True, but what stupid beasts they are to continue to come to a region from whence none of them has ever returned." "Let us tarry and watch the end of this one," suggested one of the men. The officer looked toward the city. "The watch has seen him," he said. "We may remain, for we may be needed." I looked toward the city and saw several hundred warriors issuing from the nearest gate. They moved leisurely, as though there were no need for haste, nor was there, as I was presently to learn. Then I turned my eyes once more toward the flyer. She was moving rapidly toward the city, and, when she had come close enough, I was surprised to see that her propellers were idle. Straight for that grim shaft she bore. At the last minute I saw the great blades move to reverse her, yet on she came as though drawn by some mighty, irresistible power. Intense excitement prevailed upon her deck, where men were running hither and thither, manning the guns and preparing to launch the small one-man flyers, a fleet of which is part of the equipment of every Martian war vessel. Closer and closer to the black shaft the ship sped. In another instant she must strike, and then I saw the familiar signal flown that sends the lesser boats in a great flock from the deck of the mother ship. Instantly 100 tiny flyers rose from her deck like a swarm of huge dragonflies, but scarcely were they clear of the battleship than the nose of each turned toward the shaft, and they too rushed on at frightful speed toward the same, now seemingly inevitable end that menaced the larger vessel. A moment later the collision came. Men were hurled in every direction from the ship's deck, while she, bent and crumpled, took the last long plunge to the scrap heap at the shaft's base. With her fell a shower of her own tiny flyers, for each of them had come in violent collision with the solid shaft. I noticed that the wrecked flyers scraped down the shaft's side, and that their fall was not as rapid as might have been expected. And then, suddenly, the secret of the shaft burst upon me, and with it an explanation of the cause that prevented a flyer that passed too far across the ice barrier ever returning. The shaft was a mighty magnet, and when once a vessel came within the radius of its powerful attraction for the aluminum steel that enters so largely into the construction of all Barsoomian craft, no power on earth could prevent such an end as we had just witnessed. I afterward learned that the shaft rests directly over the magnetic pole of Mars, but whether this adds in any way to its incalculable power of attraction, I do not know. I am a fighting man, not a scientist. Here, at last, was an explanation of the long absence of Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak. These valiant and intrepid warriors had dared the mysteries and dangers of the frozen north to search for Thoris, whose long absence had bowed in grief the head of his beautiful mother, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium. The moment that the last of the flyers came to rest at the base of the shaft, the black-bearded yellow warriors swarmed over the massive wreckage upon which they lay, making prisoners of those who were uninjured, and occasionally dispatching with a sword thrust one of the wounded, who seemed prone to resent their taunts and insults. A few of the uninjured red men battled bravely against their cruel foes, but for the most part they seemed too overwhelmed by the horror of the catastrophe that had befallen them to do more than submit supinely to the golden chains with which they were manacled. When the last of the prisoners had been confined, the party returned to the city, at the gate of which we met a pack of fierce gold-collared Apts, each of which marched between two warriors, who held them with strong chains of the same metal as their collars. Just beyond the gate, the attendants loosened the whole terrible herd, and as they bounded off toward the grim black shaft, I did not need to ask to know their mission. Had there not been those within the cruel city of Kadabra who needed succor far worse than the poor unfortunate dead and dying out there in the cold upon the bent and broken carcasses of 1,000 flyers, I could not have restrained my desire to hasten back and do battle with those horrid creatures that had been dispatched to rend and devour them. As it was, I could but follow the yellow warriors with bowed head and give thanks for the chance that had given Thuvan Din and me such easy ingress to the capital of Silensis Ol. Once within the gates, we had no difficulty in eluding our friends of the morning, and presently found ourselves in a Martian hostelry. End of chapter 9. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Warlord of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Endurance. The public houses of Barsoom, I have found, vary but little. There is no privacy for other than married couples. Men without their wives are escorted to a large chamber, the floor of which is usually of white marble or heavy glass, kept scrupulously clean. Here are many small raised platforms for the guest's sleeping silks and furs, and if he have none of his own, clean fresh ones are furnished at a nominal charge. Once a man's belongings have been deposited upon one of these platforms, he is a guest of the house, and that platform is his own until he leaves. No one will disturb or molest his belongings, as there are no thieves upon Mars. As assassination is the one thing to be feared, the proprietors of the hostelries furnished armed guards who pace back and forth through the sleeping rooms day and night. The number of guards and gorgeousness of their trappings quite usually denote the status of the hotel. No meals are served in these houses, but generally a public eating place adjoins them. Baths are connected with the sleeping chambers, and each guest is required to bathe daily or depart from the hotel. Usually, on a second or third floor, there is a large sleeping room for single women guests, but its appointments do not vary materially from the chamber occupied by men. The guards who watch the women remain in the corridor outside the sleeping chamber, while female slaves pace back and forth among the sleepers within, ready to notify the warriors should their presence be required. I was surprised to note that all the guards with the hotel at which we stopped were red men, and on inquiring of one of them, I learned that they were slaves purchased by the proprietors of the hotels from the government. The man whose post was past my sleeping platform had been commander of the navy of a great Martian nation, but fate had carried his flagship across the ice barrier within the radius of power of the magnetic shaft, and now, for many tedious years, he had been a slave of the yellow men. He told me that princes, jeds, and even jedaks of the outer world were among the menials who served the yellow race. But when I asked him if he had heard of the fate of Mors Kajak or Tardos Mors, he shook his head, saying that he had never heard of their being prisoners here, though he was very familiar with the reputations and fame they bore in the outer world. Neither had he heard any rumor of the coming of the father of Therns and the black Dator of the firstborn, but he hastened to explain that he knew little of what took place within the palace. I could see that he wondered not a little that a yellow man should be so inquisitive about certain red prisoners from beyond the ice barrier, and that I should be so ignorant of customs and conditions among my own race. In fact, I had forgotten my disguise upon discovering a red man pacing before my sleeping platform, but his growing expression of surprise warned me in time, for I had no mind to reveal my identity to any, unless some good could come of it, and I did not see how this poor fellow could serve me yet, though I had it in my mind that later I might be the means of serving him, and all the other thousands of prisoners who do the bidding of their stern masters in Kadabra. Van Din and I discussed our plans as we sat together among our sleeping silks and furs that night, in the midst of the hundreds of yellow men who occupied the apartment with us. We spoke in low whispers, but as that is only what courtesy demands in a public sleeping place, we roused no suspicion. At last, determining that all must be but idle speculation, until after we had had a chance to explore the city and attempt to put into execution the plan that Talu had suggested, we bade each other good night and turned to sleep. After breakfasting the following morning, we set out to see Kadabra, and, as through the generosity of the Prince of Marentina we were well supplied with the funds current in Okar, we purchased a handsome ground flyer. Having learned to drive them while in Marentina, we spent a delightful and profitable day exploring the city, and late in the afternoon, at the hour Talu told us we would find government officials in their office, we stopped before a magnificent building on the plaza opposite the royal grounds and the palace. Here we walked boldly in, past the armed guard at the door, to be met by a red slave within who asked our wishes. "Tell Sorav, your master, that 2 warriors from Ilal wish to take service in the palace guard," I said. Sorav, Talu had told us, was the commander of the forces of the palace, and as men of the further cities of Okar, and especially Ilal, were less likely to be tainted with the germ of intrigue which had for years infected the household of Silencisol, He was sure that we would be welcomed and few questions asked us. He had primed us with such general information as he thought would be necessary for us to pass muster before Sorav, after which we would have to undergo a further examination before Silence's Soul, that he might determine our physical fitness and our ability as warriors. The little experience we had had with the strange hooked sword of the yellow man and his cup-like shield made it seem rather unlikely that either of us could pass this final test, but there was the chance that we might be quartered in the palace of Silence's Soul for several days, after being accepted by Sorav before the Jedak of Jedaks would find time to put us to the final test. After a wait of several minutes in an antechamber, we were summoned into the private office of Sorav, where we were courteously greeted by this ferocious-appearing black-bearded officer. He asked us our names and stations in our own city, and having received replies that were evidently satisfactory to him, he put certain questions to us that Talou had foreseen and prepared us for. The interview could not have lasted over 10 minutes, when Sorav summoned an aide whom he instructed to record us properly, and then escort us to the quarters in the palace which are set aside for aspirants to membership in the palace guard. The aide took us to his own office first, where he measured and weighed and photographed us simultaneously, with a machine ingeniously devised for that purpose, 5 copies being instantly reproduced in 5 different offices of the government, 2 of which are located in other cities, miles distant. Then he led us through the palace grounds to the main guardroom of the palace, there turning us over to the officer in charge. This individual again questioned us briefly, and finally dispatched a soldier to guide us to our quarters. These we found located upon the 2nd floor of the palace, in a semi-detached tower at the rear of the edifice. When we asked our guide why we were quartered so far from the guardroom, he replied that the custom of the older members of the guard of picking quarrels with aspirants to try their mettle had resulted in so many deaths that it was found difficult to maintain the guard at its full strength while this custom prevailed. Silence's Soul had therefore set apart these quarters for aspirants, and here they were securely locked against the danger of attack by members of the guard. This unwelcome information put a sudden check to all our well-laid plans, for it meant that we should virtually be prisoners in the palace of Silence's Soul until the time that he should see fit to give us the final examination for efficiency. As it was this interval upon which we had banked to accomplish so much in our search for Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Tarth, our chagrin was unbounded when we heard the great lock click behind our guide as he quitted us, after ushering us into the chambers we were to occupy. With a wry face I turned to Thuvandin. My companion but shook his head disconsolately, and walked to one of the windows upon the far side of the apartment. Scarcely had he gazed beyond them than he called to me in a tone of suppressed excitement and surprise. In an instant I was by his side. "Look," said Thuvandin, pointing toward the courtyard below. As my eyes followed the direction indicated, I saw 2 women pacing back and forth in an enclosed garden. At the same moment I recognized them. They were Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Tarth. There were they, whom I had trailed from one pole to another, the length of a world. Only 10 feet of space and a few metal bars separated me from them. With a cry, I attracted their attention, and as Dejah Thoris looked up, full into my eyes, I made the sign of love that the men of Barsoom make to their women. To my astonishment and horror, her head went high, and as a look of utter contempt touched her finely chiseled features, she turned her back full upon me. My body is covered with the scars of 1,000 conflicts, but never in all my long life have I suffered such anguish from a wound. For this time the steel of a woman's look had entered my heart. With a groan I turned away and buried my face in my arms. I heard Thuvandin call aloud to Thuvia, but an instant later his exclamation of surprise betokened that he too had been repulsed by his own daughter. "They will not even listen," he cried to me. "They have put their hands over their ears and walked to the farther end of the garden. Ever heard you of such mad work, John Carter? The 2 must be bewitched." Presently I mustered the courage to return to the window, for even though she spurned me, I loved her, and could not keep my eyes from feasting upon her divine face and figure. But when she saw me looking, she again turned away. I was at my wits' end to account for her strange actions, and that Thuvia too had turned against her father seemed incredible. Could it be that my incomparable princess still clung to the hideous faith from which I had rescued her world? Could it be that she looked upon me with loathing and contempt because I had returned from the valley door, or because I had desecrated the temples and persons of the holy Therns? To naught else could I ascribe her strange deportment, yet it seemed far from possible that such could be the case, for the love of Dejah Thoris for John Carter had been a great and wondrous love, far above racial distinctions, creed, or religion. As I gazed ruefully at the back of her haughty royal head, a gate at the opposite end of the garden opened, and a man entered. As he did so, he turned and slipped something into the hand of the yellow guardsman beyond the gate, nor was the distance too great that I might not see that money had passed between them. Instantly I knew that this newcomer had bribed his way within the garden. Then he turned in the direction of the two women, and I saw that he was none other than Thurid, the black dator of the firstborn. He approached quite close to them before he spoke, and as they turned at the sound of his voice, I saw Dejah Thoris shrink from him. There was a nasty leer upon his face as he stepped close to her and spoke again. I could not hear his words, but her answer came clearly. "The granddaughter of Tardos Mors can always die," she said, "but she could never live at the price you name." Then I saw the black scoundrel go upon his knees beside her, fairly groveling in the dirt, pleading with her. Only part of what he said came to me, for though he was evidently laboring under the stress of passion and excitement, it was equally apparent that he did not dare raise his voice for fear of detection. "I would save you from Matai Shang," I heard him say. "You know the fate that awaits you at his hands. Would you not choose me rather than the other?" "I would choose neither," replied Dejah Thoris, "even were I free to choose, as you know well I am not." "You are free," he cried. "John Carter, Prince of Helium, is dead." "I know better than that. But even were he dead, and I must needs choose another mate, it would be a plant man or a great white ape in preference to either Matai Shang or you, black calot," she answered with a sneer of contempt. Of a sudden the vicious beast lost all control of himself, as with a vile oath he leaped at the slender woman, gripping her tender throat in his brute clutch. Thuvia screamed and sprang to aid her fellow prisoner, and at the same instant I too went mad, and tearing at the bars that spanned my window, I ripped them from their sockets as they had been but copper wire. Hurling myself through the aperture, I reached the garden, but 100 feet from where the black was choking the life from our Dejah Thoris, and with a single great bound I was upon him. I spoke no word as I tore his defiling fingers from that beautiful throat, nor did I utter a sound as I hurled him 20 feet from me. Foaming with rage, Thurid regained his feet and charged me like a mad bull. "Yellow man," he shrieked, "you knew not upon whom you laid your vile hands, but ere I am done with you, you will know well what it means to offend the person of a firstborn." Then he was upon me, reaching for my throat, and precisely as I had done that day in the courtyard of the Temple of Isis, I did here in the garden of the Palace of Silence's Hole. I ducked beneath his outstretched arms, and as he lunged past me, I planted a terrific right upon the side of his jaw. Just as he had done upon that other occasion, he did now. Like a top, he spun round, his knees gave beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground at my feet. Then I heard a voice behind me. It was the deep voice of authority that marks the ruler of men. And when I turned to face the resplendent figure of a giant yellow man, I did not need to ask to know that it was Silence's Owl. At his right stood Matai Shang, and behind them a score of guardsmen. "Who are you?" he cried. "And what means this intrusion within the precincts of the women's garden? I do not recall your face. How came you here?" But for his last words I should have forgotten my disguise entirely, and told him outright that I was John Carter, Prince of Helium. But his question recalled me to myself. I pointed to the dislodged bars of the window above. "I am an aspirant to membership in the palace guard," I said, "and from yonder window in the tower, where I was confined awaiting the final test of fitness, I saw this brute attack this woman. I could not stand idly by, O Jedak, and see this thing done within the very palace grounds, and yet feel that I was fit to serve and guard your royal person." I had evidently made an impression upon the ruler of Okkar by my fair words, and when he turned to Dejah Thoris and Thuvia of Parth, and both had corroborated my statements, it began to look pretty dark for Thurid. I saw the ugly gleam in Matai Shang's evil eyes, as Dejah Thoris narrated all that had passed between Thurid and herself, and when she came to that part which dealt with my interference with the daughter of the firstborn, her gratitude was quite apparent, though I could see by her eyes that something puzzled her strangely. I did not wonder at her attitude toward me while others were present, but that she should have denied me while she and Thuvia were the only occupants of the garden still cut me sorely. As the examination proceeded, I cast a glance at Thurid, and startled him looking wide-eyed and wonderingly at me, and then of a sudden he laughed full in my face. A moment later Silencis Old turned toward the black. "What have you to say in explanation of these charges?" he asked in a deep and terrible voice. "Dare you aspire to one whom the father of Therns has chosen? One who might even be a fit mate for the Jedak of Jedaks himself?" And then the black-bearded tyrant turned and cast a sudden greedy look upon Dejah Thoris, as though with the words a new thought and a new desire had sprung up within his mind and breast. Thurid had been about to reply, and, with a malicious grin upon his face, was pointing an accusing finger at me, when Silencis Old's words and the expression of his face cut him short. A cunning look crept into his eyes, and I knew from the expression of his face that his next words were not the ones he had intended to speak. "O mightiest of Jedaks," he said, "the man and the women do not speak the truth. The fellow had come into the garden to assist them to escape. I was beyond, and overheard their conversation, and when I entered, the woman screamed, and the man sprang upon me and would have killed me. What know you of this man? He is a stranger to you, and I dare say that you will find him an enemy and a spy. Let him be put on trial, Silencis Old, rather than your friend and guest Thurid, daughter of the firstborn." Silencis Old looked puzzled. He turned again and looked upon Dejah Thoris, and then Thurid stepped quite close to him and whispered something in his ear. What, I know not. Presently the yellow ruler turned to one of his officers. "See that this man be securely confined until we have time to go deeper into this affair," he commanded, "and as bars alone seem inadequate to restrain him, let chains be added." Then he turned and left the garden, taking Dejah Thoris with him, his hand upon her shoulder. Thurid and Matai Shang went also, and as they reached the gateway, the black turned and laughed again aloud in my face. What could be the meaning of his sudden change toward me? Could he suspect my true identity? It must be that. And the thing that had betrayed me was the trick and blow that had laid him low for the second time. As the guards dragged me away, my heart was very sad and bitter indeed. For now, to the two relentless enemies that had hounded her for so long, another and a more powerful one had been added. For I would have been but a fool had I not recognized the sudden love for Dejah Thoris that had just been born in the terrible breast of Silencis Old, Jedak of Jedaks, ruler of Okkar. End of chapter 10. Recording by Thomas Copeland. of the Warlord of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Pit of Plenty. I did not languish long within the prison of Silence's Ol. During the short time that I lay there, fettered with chains of gold, I often wondered as to the fate of Thuvan Din, Jedak of Tarth. My brave companion had followed me into the garden as I attacked Thurid, and when Silence's Ol had left with Dejah Thoris and the others, leaving Thuvi of Tarth behind, he too had remained in the garden with his daughter, apparently unnoticed, for he was apparelled similarly to the guards. The last I had seen of him, he stood waiting for the warriors who escorted me to close the gate behind them, that he might be alone with Thuvia. Could it be possible that they had escaped? I doubted it, and yet with all my heart I hoped that it might be true. The third day of my incarceration brought a dozen warriors to escort me to the audience chamber, where Silence's Ol himself was to try me. A great number of nobles crowded the room, and among them I saw Thurid, but Matai Shang was not there. Dejah Thoris, as radiantly beautiful as ever, sat upon a small throne beside Silence's Ol. The expression of sad hopelessness upon her dear face cut deep into my heart. Her position beside the Jedak of Jedaks boded ill for her and me, and on the instant that I saw her there sprang to my mind the firm intention never to leave that chamber alive, if I must leave her in the clutches of this powerful tyrant. I had killed better men than Silence's Ol, and killed them with my bare hands, and now I swore to myself that I should kill him, if I found that the only way to save the Princess of Helium. That it would mean almost instant death for me, I cared not, except that it would remove me from further efforts in behalf of Dejah Thoris, and for this reason alone I would have chosen another way, for even though I should kill Silence's Ol, that act would not restore my beloved wife to her own people. I had determined to wait the final outcome of the trial, that I might learn all that I could of the Ocarian ruler's intentions, and then act accordingly. Scarcely had I come before him, than Silence's Ol summoned Thurid also. "Daughter Thurid," he said, "you have made a strange request of me, but in accordance with your wishes, and your promise that it will result only to my interests, I have decided to accede. You tell me that a certain announcement will be the means of convicting this prisoner, and at the same time open the way to the gratification of my dearest wish." Thurid nodded. "Then shall I make the announcement here before all my nobles?" continued Silence's Ol. "For a year no queen has sat upon the throne beside me, and now it suits me to take to wife one who is reputed the most beautiful woman upon Barsoom, a statement which none may truthfully deny. Nobles of Okar, unsheathe your swords, and do homage to Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, and future Queen of Okar, for at the end of the allotted 10 days, she shall become the wife of Silence's Ol." As the nobles drew their blades and lifted them on high, in accordance with the ancient custom of Okar, when a Jedak announces his intention to wed, Dejah Thoris sprang to her feet, and raising her hand aloft, cried in a loud voice that they desist. "I may not be the wife of Silence's Ol," she pleaded, "for already I be a wife and mother. John Carter, Prince of Helium, still lives. I know it to be true, for I overheard Matai Shang tell his daughter Fedor that he had seen him in Caor, at the court of Kulan Tith Jedak. But Jedak does not wed a married woman, nor will Silence's Ol thus violate the bonds of matrimony." Silence's Ol turned upon Thurid with an ugly look. "Is this the surprise you held in store for me?" he cried. "You assured me that no obstacle which might not be easily overcome stood between me and this woman, and now I find that the one insuperable obstacle intervenes. What mean you, man? What have you to say?" "And should I deliver John Carter into your hands, Silence's Ol, would you not feel that I had more than satisfied the promise that I made you?" answered Thurid. Talk not like a fool, cried the enraged Jedak. I am no child to be thus played with. I am talking only as a man who knows, replied Thurid, knows that he can do all that he claims. Then turn John Carter over to me within 10 days, or yourself suffer the end that I should mete out to him, were he in my power, snapped the Jedak of Jedaks with an ugly scowl. You need not wait 10 days, Silencesoul, replied Thurid, and then, turning suddenly upon me, as he extended a pointing finger, he cried, There stands John Carter, Prince of Helium. Fool, shrieked Silencesoul, fool! John Carter is a white man. This fellow be as yellow as myself. John Carter's face is smooth. Matai Shang has described him to me. This prisoner has a beard and mustache as large and black as any in Okar. Quick, guardsmen, to the pits with the black maniac who wishes to throw his life away for a poor joke upon your ruler. Hold, cried Thurid, and springing forward before I could guess his intention, he had grasped my beard and ripped the whole false fabric from my face and head, revealing my smooth, tanned skin beneath and my close-cropped black hair. Instantly pandemonium reigned in the audience chamber of Silencesoul. Warriors pressed forward with drawn blades, thinking that I might be contemplating the assassination of the Jedak of Jedaks, while others, out of curiosity to see one whose name was familiar from pole to pole, crowded behind their fellows. As my identity was revealed, I saw Dejah Thoris spring to her feet, amazement writ large upon her face. And then, through that jam of armed men, she forced her way before any could prevent. A moment only, and she was before me with outstretched arms and eyes filled with the light of her great love. John Carter, she cried, as I folded her to my breast. And then, of a sudden, I knew why she had denied me in the garden beneath the tower. What a fool I had been, expecting that she would penetrate the marvelous disguise that had been wrought for me by the barber of Marentina. She had not known me, that was all. And when she saw the sign of love from a stranger, she was offended and righteously indignant. Indeed, but I had been a fool. And it was you, she cried, who spoke to me from the tower. How could I dream that my beloved Virginian lay behind that fierce beard and that yellow skin? She had been wont to call me her Virginian as a term of endearment, for she knew that I loved the sound of that beautiful name, made 1,000 times more beautiful and hallowed by her dear lips. And as I heard it again after all those long years, my eyes became dimmed with tears, and my voice choked with emotion. But an instant did I crush that dear form to me, ere Silencesoul, trembling with rage and jealousy, shouldered his way to us. Seize the man, he cried to his warriors, and 100 ruthless hands tore us apart. Well it was for the nobles of the court of Okar that John Carter had been disarmed. As it was, 12 of them felt the weight of my clenched fists, and I had fought my way half up the steps before the throne, to which Silencesoul had carried Dejah Thoris ere ever they could stop me. Then I went down, fighting, beneath 100 warriors. But before they had battered me into unconsciousness, I heard that, from the lips of Dejah Thoris, that made all my suffering well worth while. Standing there beside the great tyrant, who clutched her by the arm, she pointed to where I fought alone against such awful odds. Think you, Silencesoul, that the wife of such as he is, she cried, would ever dishonor his memory, were he 1,000 times dead, by mating with a lesser mortal? Lives there, upon any world, such another as John Carter, Prince of Helium? Lives there another man who could fight his way back and forth across a warlike planet, facing savage beasts and hordes of savage men for the love of a woman? I, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, am his. He fought for me and won me. If you be a brave man, you will honor the bravery that is his, and you will not kill him. Make him a slave, if you will, Silencesoul, but spare his life. I would rather be a slave with such as he, than be queen of Okar. Neither slave nor queen dictates to Silence's owl, replied the Jedak of Jedaks. John Carter shall die a natural death in the pit of plenty, and the day he dies, Dejah Thoris shall become my queen. I did not hear her reply, for it was then that a blow upon my head brought unconsciousness, and when I recovered my senses, only a handful of guardsmen remained in the audience chamber with me. As I opened my eyes, they goaded me with the points of their swords and bade me rise. Then they led me through long corridors to a court far toward the center of the palace. In the center of the court was a deep pit, near the edge of which stood half a dozen other guardsmen awaiting me. One of them carried a long rope in his hands, which he commenced to make ready as we approached. We had come to within 50 feet of these men, when I felt a sudden strange and rapid pricking sensation in one of my fingers. For a moment I was nonplussed by the odd feeling, and then there came to me recollection of that which in the stress of my adventure I had entirely forgotten, the gift ring of Prince Talu of Marentina. Instantly I looked toward the group we were nearing, at the same time raising my left hand to my forehead, that the ring might be visible to one who sought it. Simultaneously, one of the waiting warriors raised his left hand, ostensibly to brush back his hair, and upon one of his fingers I saw the duplicate of my own ring. A quick look of intelligence passed between us, after which I kept my eyes turned away from the warrior, and did not look at him again, for fear that I might arouse the suspicion of the Ocarians. When we reached the edge of the pit, I saw that it was very deep, and presently I realized I was soon to judge just how far it extended below the surface of the cord, for he who held the rope passed it about my body in such a way that it could be released from above at any time. And then, as all the warriors grasped it, he pushed me forward, and I fell into the yawning abyss. After the first jerk, as I reached the end of the rope that had been paid out to let me fall below the pit's edge, they lowered me quickly but smoothly. The moment before the plunge, while 2 or 3 of the men had been assisting in adjusting the rope about me, one of them had brought his mouth close to my cheek, and in the brief interval before I was cast into the forbidding hole, he breathed a single word into my ear: "Courage." The pit, which my imagination had pictured as bottomless, proved to be not more than 100 feet in depth, but as its walls were smoothly polished, it might as well have been 1,000 feet, for I could never hope to escape without outside assistance. For a day I was left in darkness, and then, quite suddenly, a brilliant light illumined my strange cell. I was reasonably hungry and thirsty by this time, not having tasted food or drink since the day prior to my incarceration. To my amazement, I found the sides of the pit, that I had thought smooth, lined with shelves, upon which were the most delicious viands and liquid refreshments that Okar afforded. With an exclamation of delight, I sprang forward to partake of some of the welcome food, but ere ever I reached it, the light was extinguished, and though I groped my way about the chamber, my hands came in contact with nothing beside the smooth, hard wall that I had felt on my first examination of my prison. Immediately the pangs of hunger and thirst began to assail me. Where before I had had but a mild craving for food and drink, I now actually suffered for want of it, and all because of the tantalizing sight that I had had of food almost within my grasp. Once more darkness and silence enveloped me, a silence that was broken only by a single mocking laugh. For another day nothing occurred to break the monotony of my imprisonment, or relieve the suffering superinduced by hunger and thirst. Slowly the pangs became less keen, as suffering deadened the activity of certain nerves. And then the light flashed on once again, and before me stood an array of new and tempting dishes, with great bottles of clear water and flagons of refreshing wine, upon the outside of which the cold sweat of condensation stood. Again, with the hunger madness of a wild beast, I sprang forward to seize those tempting dishes, but as before the light went out, and I came to a sudden stop against a hard wall. Then the mocking laugh rang out for a second time. The pit of plenty. Ah, what a cruel mind must have devised this exquisite hellish torture. Day after day was the thing repeated, until I was on the verge of madness, and then, as I had done in the pits of the war-hounds, I took a new firm hold upon my reason, and forced it back into the channels of sanity. By sheer willpower I regained control over my tottering mentality, and so successful was I that the next time that the light came, I sat quite still and looked indifferently at the fresh and tempting food almost within my reach. Glad I was that I had done so, for it gave me an opportunity to solve the seeming mystery of those vanishing banquets. As I made no move to reach the food, the torturers left the light turned on in the hope that at last I could refrain no longer from giving them the delicious thrill of enjoyment that my former futile efforts to obtain it had caused. And as I sat scrutinizing the laden shelves, I presently saw how the thing was accomplished, and so simple was it that I wondered I had not guessed it before. The wall of my prison was of clearest glass. Behind the glass were the tantalizing viands. After nearly an hour, the light went out, but this time there was no mocking laughter, at least not upon the part of my tormentors. But I, to be quits with them, gave a low laugh that none might mistake for the cackle of a maniac. 9 days passed, and I was weak from hunger and thirst, but no longer suffering. I was past that. Then, down through the darkness above, a little parcel fell to the floor at my side. Indifferently I groped for it, thinking it but some new invention of my jailers to add to my sufferings. At last I found it, a tiny package wrapped in paper, at the end of a strong and slender cord. As I opened it, a few lozenges fell to the floor. As I gathered them up, feeling of them and smelling of them, I discovered that they were tablets of concentrated food, such as are quite common in all parts of Barsoom. Poison, I thought. Well, what of it? Why not end my misery now, rather than drag out a few more wretched days in this dark pit? Slowly I raised one of the little pellets to my lips. "Goodbye, my Dejah Thoris," I breathed. "I have lived for you and fought for you, and now my next dearest wish is to be realized, for I shall die for you." And taking the morsel in my mouth, I devoured it. One by one I ate them all, nor ever did anything taste better than those tiny bits of nourishment, within which I knew must lie the seeds of death, possibly of some hideous, torturing death. As I sat quietly upon the floor of my prison, waiting for the end, my fingers by accident came in contact with the bit of paper in which the things had been wrapped. And as I idly played with it, my mind roaming far back into the past, that I might live again for a few brief moments before I died, some of the many happy moments of a long and happy life, I became aware of strange protuberances upon the smooth surface of the parchment-like substance in my hands. For a time they carried no special significance to my mind. I merely was mildly wondrous that they were there. But at last they seemed to take form, and then I realized that there was but a single line of them, like writing. Now, more interestedly, my fingers traced and retraced them. There were 4 separate and distinct combinations of raised lines. Could it be that these were 4 words, and that they were intended to carry a message to me? The more I thought of it, the more excited I became, until my fingers raced madly back and forth over those bewildering little hills and valleys upon that bit of paper. But I could make nothing of them, and at last I decided that my very haste was preventing me from solving the mystery. Then I took it more slowly. Again and again my forefinger traced the first of those 4 combinations. Martian writing is rather difficult to explain to an Earthman. It is something of a cross between shorthand and picture writing, and it is an entirely different language from the spoken language of Mars. Upon Barsoom there is but a single oral language. It is spoken today by every race and nation, just as it was at the beginning of human life upon Barsoom. It has grown with the growth of the planet's learning and scientific achievements, but so ingenious a thing it is that new words to express new thoughts or describe new conditions or discoveries form themselves. No other word could explain the thing that a new word is required for, other than the word that naturally falls to it. And so, no matter how far removed two nations or races, their spoken languages are identical. Not so their written languages, however. No two nations have the same written language, and often cities of the same nation have a written language that differs greatly from that of the nation to which they belong. Thus it was that the signs upon the paper, if in reality they were words, baffled me for some time, but at last I made out the first one. It was courage, and it was written in the letters of Marentina. Courage! That was the word the yellow guardsman had whispered in my ear as I stood upon the verge of the pit of plenty. The message must be from him, and he, I knew, was a friend. With renewed hope, I bent my every energy to the deciphering of the balance of the message, and at last success rewarded my endeavor. I had read the 4 words: courage, follow the rope. End of chapter 11. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Of the Warlord of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Follow the rope. What could it mean? Follow the rope. What rope? Presently I recalled the cord that had been attached to the parcel when it fell at my side, and after a little groping my hand came in contact with it again. It depended from above, and when I pulled upon it I discovered that it was rigidly fastened, probably at the pit's mouth. Upon examination, I found that the cord, though small, was amply able to sustain the weight of several men. Then I made another discovery. There was a second message knotted in the rope at about the height of my head. This I deciphered more easily now that the key was mine. Bring the rope with you. Beyond the knots lies danger. That was all there was to this message. It was evidently hastily formed, an afterthought. I did not pause longer than to learn the contents of the second message, and though I was none too sure of the meaning of the final admonition, beyond the knots lies danger, yet I was sure that here before me lay an avenue of escape, and that the sooner I took advantage of it, the more likely was I to win to liberty. At least I could be but little worse off than I had been in the pit of plenty. I was to find, however, ere I was well out of that damnable hole, that I might have been very much worse off had I been compelled to remain there another 2 minutes. It had taken me about that length of time to ascend some 50 feet above the bottom, when a noise above attracted my attention. To my chagrin, I saw that the covering of the pit was being removed far above me, and in the light of the courtyard beyond, I saw a number of yellow warriors. Could it be that I was laboriously working my way into some new trap? Were the messages spurious after all? And then, just as my hope and courage had ebbed to their lowest, I saw 2 things. One was the body of a huge, struggling, snarling apt being lowered over the side of the pit toward me, and the other was an aperture in the side of the shaft, an aperture larger than a man's body, into which my rope led. Just as I scrambled into the dark hole before me, the apt passed me, reaching out with his mighty hands to clutch me, and snapping, growling, and roaring in a most frightful manner. Plainly now I saw the end for which Silence's soul had destined me. After first torturing me with starvation, he had caused this fierce beast to be lowered into my prison to finish the work that the Jedak's hellish imagination had conceived. And then another truth flashed upon me. I had lived 9 days of the allotted 10 which must intervene before Silensis Ol could make Dejah Thoris his queen. The purpose of the apt was to ensure my death before the 10th day. I almost laughed aloud as I thought how Silensis Ol's measure of safety was to aid in defeating the very end he sought. For when they discovered that the apt was alone in the pit of plenty, they could not know but that he had completely devoured me, and so no suspicion of my escape would cause a search to be made for me. Coiling the rope that had carried me thus far upon my strange journey, I sought for the other end, but found that as I followed it forward, it extended always before me. So this was the meaning of the words, "follow the rope." The tunnel through which I crawled was low and dark. I had followed it for several 100 yards when I felt a knot beneath my fingers. Beyond the knots lies danger. Now I went with the utmost caution, and a moment later a sharp turn in the tunnel brought me to an opening into a large, brilliantly lighted chamber. The trend of the tunnel I had been traversing had been slightly upward, and from this I judged that the chamber, into which I now found myself looking, must be either on the first floor of the palace, or directly beneath the first floor. Upon the opposite wall were many strange instruments and devices, and in the center of the room stood a long table, at which 2 men were seated in earnest conversation. He who faced me was a yellow man, a little, wizened-up, pasty-faced old fellow, with great eyes that showed the white round the entire circumference of the iris. His companion was a black man, and I did not need to see his face to know that it was Thurid, for there was no other of the firstborn north of the ice barrier. Thurid was speaking as I came within hearing of the men's voices. "Solon," he was saying, "there is no risk, and the reward is great. You know that you hate Silensis Ol, and that nothing would please you more than to thwart him in some cherished plan. There be nothing that he more cherishes today than the idea of wedding the beautiful princess of Helium. But I too want her, and with your help I may win her. You need not more than step from this room for an instant when I give you the signal. I will do the rest, and then, when I am gone, you may come and throw the great switch back into its place, and all will be as before. I need but an hour's start to be safe beyond the devilish power that you control in this hidden chamber beneath the palace of your master. See how easy—" And with the words the black dator rose from his seat, and crossing the room laid his hand upon a large burnished lever that protruded from the opposite wall. "No, no!" cried the little old man, springing after him with a wild shriek. "Not that one, not that one! That controls the sun-ray tanks, and should you pull it too far down, all Kadabra would be consumed by heat before I could replace it. Come away, come away! You know not with what mighty powers you play. This is the lever that you seek. Note well the symbol inlaid in white upon its ebon surface." Thurid approached and examined the handle of the lever. "Ah, a magnet," he said. "I will remember. It is settled then, I take it," he continued. The old man hesitated. A look of combined greed and apprehension overspread his none too beautiful features. "Double the figure," he said. "Even that were all too small an amount for the service you ask. Why, I risk my life by even entertaining you here within the forbidden precincts of my station. Should Silensis Ol learn of it, he would have me thrown to the apts before the day was done. He dare not do that, and you know it full well, Solon," contradicted the black. "Too great a power of life and death you hold over the people of Kadabra for Silensis Ol ever to risk threatening you with death. Before ever his minions could lay their hands upon you, you might seize this very lever from which you have just warned me, and wipe out the entire city, and myself into the bargain," said Solon with a shudder. "But if you were to die anyway, you would find the nerve to do it," replied Thurid. "Yes," muttered Solon, "I have often thought upon that very thing. Well, firstborn, is your red princess worth the price I ask for my services? Or will you go without her, and see her in the arms of Silence's soul tomorrow night? Take your price, yellow man, replied Thurid with an oath. Half now, and the balance when you have fulfilled your contract. With that, the Daughter threw a well-filled money pouch upon the table. Solon opened the pouch, and with trembling fingers counted its contents. His weird eyes assumed a greedy expression, and his unkempt beard and mustache twitched with the muscles of his mouth and chin. It was quite evident from his very mannerism that Thurid had keenly guessed the man's weakness. Even the claw-like clutching movement of the fingers betokened the avariciousness of the miser. Having satisfied himself that the amount was correct, Solon replaced the money in the pouch and rose from the table. Now, he said, are you quite sure that you know the way to your destination? You must travel quickly to cover the ground to the cave, and from thence beyond the great power, all within a brief hour, for no more dare I spare you. Let me repeat it to you, said Thurid, that you may see if I be letter perfect. Proceed, replied Solon. Through yonder door, he commenced, pointing to a door at the far end of the apartment. I follow a corridor, passing 3 diverging corridors upon my right, then into the 4th right-hand corridor, straight to where 3 corridors meet. There again I follow to the right, hugging the left wall closely to avoid the pit. At the end of this corridor, I shall come to a spiral runway, which I must follow down instead of up. After that, the way is along but a single branchless corridor. Am I right? Quite right, Daughter, answered Solon. And now, begone. Already you have tempted fate too long within this forbidden place. Tonight, or tomorrow, then, you may expect the signal, said Thurid, rising to go. Tonight or tomorrow, repeated Solon, and as the door closed behind his guest, the old man continued to mutter as he turned back to the table, where he again dumped the contents of the money pouch, running his fingers through the heap of shining metal, piling the coins into little towers, counting, recounting, and fondling the wealth, the while he muttered on and on in a crooning undertone. Presently his fingers ceased their play. His eyes popped wider than ever as they fastened upon the door through which Thurid had disappeared. The croon changed to a querulous muttering, and finally to an ugly growl. Then the old man rose from the table, shaking his fist at the closed door. Now he raised his voice, and his words came distinctly. Fool, he muttered, think you that for your happiness Solon will give up his life? If you escaped, Silence's soul would know that only through my connivance could you have succeeded. Then would he send for me. What would you have me do? Reduce the city and myself to ashes? No, fool, there is a better way for Solon to keep thy money and be revenged upon Silence's soul. He laughed in a nasty, cackling note. Poor fool, you may throw the great switch that will give you the freedom of the air of Okar, and then in fatuous security go on with thy red princess to the freedom of death. When you have passed beyond this chamber in your flight, what can prevent Solon replacing the switch as it was before your vile hand touched it? Nothing. And then the guardian of the north will claim you and your woman, and Silence's soul, when he sees your dead bodies, will never dream that the hand of Solon had aught to do with the thing. Then his voice dropped once more into mutterings that I could not translate. But I had heard enough to cause me to guess a great deal more, and I thanked the kind Providence that had led me to this chamber at a time so filled with importance to Dejah Thoris and myself as this. But how to pass the old man now? The cord, almost invisible upon the floor, stretched straight across the apartment to a door upon the far side. There was no other way of which I knew, nor could I afford to ignore the advice follow the rope. I must cross this room, but however I should accomplish it, undetected, with that old man in the very center of it, baffled me. Of course, I might have sprung in upon him, and with my bare hand silenced him forever, but I had heard enough to convince me that with him alive, the knowledge that I had gained might serve me at some future moment, while, should I kill him, and another be stationed at his place, Thurid would not come hither with Dejah Thoris, as was quite evidently his intention. As I stood in the dark shadow of the tunnel's end, racking my brain for a feasible plan, the while I watched cat-like the old man's every move, he took up the money pouch and crossed to one end of the apartment, where, bending to his knees, he fumbled with a panel in the wall. Instantly I guessed that here was the hiding place in which he hoarded his wealth, and while he bent there, his back toward me, I entered the chamber upon tiptoe, and with the utmost stealth essayed to reach the opposite side before he should complete his task and turn again toward the room's center. Scarcely 30 steps, all told, must I take, and yet it seemed to my overwrought imagination that that farther wall was miles away. But at last I reached it, nor once had I taken my eyes from the back of the old miser's head. He did not turn until my hand was upon the button that controlled the door through which my way led, and then he turned away from me as I passed through and gently closed the door. For an instant I paused, my ear close to the panel, to learn if he had suspected aught. But as no sound of pursuit came from within, I wheeled and made my way along the new corridor, following the rope, which I coiled and brought with me as I advanced. But a short distance farther on, I came to the rope's end, at a point where 5 corridors met. What was I to do? Which way should I turn? I was nonplussed. A careful examination of the end of the rope revealed the fact that it had been cleanly cut with some sharp instrument. This fact, and the words that had cautioned me that danger lay beyond the knots, convinced me that the rope had been severed since my friend had placed it as my guide, for I had but passed a single knot, whereas there had evidently been 2 or more in the entire length of the cord. Now indeed was I in a pretty fix, for neither did I know which avenue to follow, nor when danger lay directly in my path. But there was nothing else to be done than follow one of the corridors, for I could gain nothing by remaining where I was. So I chose the central opening, and passed on into its gloomy depths with a prayer upon my lips. The floor of the tunnel rose rapidly as I advanced, and a moment later the way came to an abrupt end before a heavy door. I could hear nothing beyond, and with my accustomed rashness pushed the portal wide to step into a room filled with yellow warriors. The first to see me opened his eyes wide in astonishment, and at the same instant I felt the tingling sensation in my finger that denoted the presence of a friend of the ring. Then others saw me, and there was a concerted rush to lay hands upon me, for these were all members of the palace guard, men familiar with my face. The first to reach me was the wearer of the mate to my strange ring, and as he came close he whispered, "Surrender to me." Then, in a loud voice, shouted, "You are my prisoner, white man," and menaced me with his 2 weapons. And so John Carter, Prince of Helium, meekly surrendered to a single antagonist. The others now swarmed about us, asking many questions, but I would not talk to them, and finally my captor announced that he would lead me back to my cell. An officer ordered several other warriors to accompany him, and a moment later we were retracing the way I had just come. My friend walked close beside me, asking many silly questions about the country from which I had come, until finally his fellows paid no further attention to him or his gabbling. Gradually, as he spoke, he lowered his voice, so that presently he was able to converse with me in a low tone without attracting attention. His ruse was a clever one, and showed that Talou had not misjudged the man's fitness for the dangerous duty upon which he was detailed. When he had fully assured himself that the other guardsmen were not listening, he asked me why I had not followed the rope, and when I told him that it had ended at the 5 corridors, he said that it must have been cut by someone in need of a piece of rope, for he was sure that the stupid Kadabrans would never have guessed its purpose. Before we had reached the spot from which the 5 corridors diverge, my Marentinian friend had managed to drop to the rear of the little column with me, and when we came in sight of the branching ways, he whispered, "Run up the first upon the right. It leads to the watchtower upon the south wall. I will direct the pursuit up the next corridor." And with that he gave me a great shove into the dark mouth of the tunnel, at the same time crying out in simulated pain and alarm as he threw himself upon the floor, as though I had felled him with a blow. From behind, the voices of the excited guardsmen came reverberating along the corridor, suddenly growing fainter as Talou's spy led them up the wrong passageway in fancied pursuit. As I ran for my life through the dark galleries beneath the palace of Silenzasol, I must indeed have presented a remarkable appearance, had there been any to note it, for though death loomed large about me, my face was split by a broad grin as I thought of the resourcefulness of the nameless hero of Marentina, to whom I owed my life. Of such stuff are the men of my beloved Helium, and when I meet another of their kind, of whatever race or color, my heart goes out to him as it did now to my new friend, who had risked his life for me simply because I wore the mate to the ring his ruler had put upon his finger. The corridor along which I ran led almost straight for a considerable distance, terminating at the foot of a spiral runway, up which I proceeded, to emerge presently into a circular chamber upon the first floor of a tower. In this apartment 12 red slaves were employed polishing or repairing the weapons of the yellow men. The walls of the room were lined with racks, in which were hundreds of straight and hooked swords, javelins, and daggers. It was evidently an armory. There were but 3 warriors guarding the workers. My eyes took in the entire scene at a glance. Here were weapons in plenty. Here were sinewy red warriors to wield them. And here now was John Carter, Prince of Helium, in need both of weapons and warriors. As I stepped into the apartment, guards and prisoners saw me simultaneously. Close to the entrance where I stood was a rack of straight swords, and as my hand closed upon the hilt of one of them, my eyes fell upon the faces of 2 of the prisoners who worked side by side. One of the guards started toward me. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you do here?" "I come for Tardos Mors, Jedak of Helium, and his son, Mors Kajak," I cried, pointing to the 2 red prisoners, who had now sprung to their feet, wide-eyed in astonished recognition. "Rise, red men! Before we die, let us leave a memorial in the palace of Okar's tyrant, that will stand forever in the annals of Kadabra, to the honor and glory of Helium." For I had seen that all the prisoners there were men of Tardos Mors's navy. Then the first guardsman was upon me, and the fight was on. But scarce did we engage, ere, to my horror, I saw that the red slaves were shackled to the floor. End of chapter 12. Recording by Thomas Copeland.